I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. With intensive care units in some parts of the country filled to capacity, the race is on to get more COVID-19 shots into the arms of Canadians. Almost 2.2 million vaccine doses are expected to arrive in the country this week. That includes the first batch of Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines coming from the Global Vaccine Sharing COVAX initiative, which was designed to ensure vaccines are equitably distributed to poor countries. As a contributor to the initiative, Canada covers the cost of half the vaccines for poorer countries and secures up to 15 million doses of vaccines for its own use. Canada's Chief Public Health Officer is again urging everyone to keep their guards up amid a surge in more contagious variants of COVID-19. Dr. Theresa Tam says Canadians need to be careful since the more contagious variants of concern could be anywhere. Quebec, which has been struggling with the third wave of COVID-19 driven by the variants, announced that it would add more regions to a list of places under lockdown that already includes Quebec. Health Canada says people should not use face masks that contain graphene or biomass graphene. The agency says the research suggests particles in the masks can cause early lung toxicity in animals. It notes that the risks to humans are not yet known. It says anyone who has worn a graphene mask should consult their healthcare provider if they have shortness of breath or difficulty breathing. Health Canada has directed distributors, importers, and manufacturers to stop selling the masks and has also advised provinces and territories to discontinue their use. The Prime Minister is acknowledging COVID-19 forced Canadians to mark Easter and Passover differently for a second straight year. Justin Trudeau says he knows many had to forego in-person church services and family dinners, but the PM is urging Canadians to stay optimistic, suggesting that the battle with the pandemic is drawing to a close, saying, quote, "Soon this crisis will end." Several other politicians also sent out Easter messages, paying tribute to frontline workers and encouraging Canadians to respect pandemic-related safety measures over the holiday. One of HMCS Corner Brook's main ballast tanks ruptured last March during a test by Babcock Canada, and the report suggests even more repairs, or even after repairs were done, some of the damage will be lasting and will need to be monitored by the Navy. The submarine was supposed to return to service last summer, but will now remain docked until at least June. Questions about the benefits and costs of Canada's submarines have circulated since Ottawa bought the vessels from Britain in the late 90s. Canada's top procurement official says he doesn't expect to change plans on the construction of a fleet of new Navy warships. That comes after Parliament's budget watchdog warned of escalating costs that could total about $77 billion. Troy Crosby, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Material at the Department of National Defence, says he remains confident in Ottawa's estimated $60 billion price tag for the 15 vessels. He suggests changing things now would only lead to delays and undercut the Navy's ability to protect Canada. Long thought to be a potential federal Liberal leader, Mark Carney will be a keynote speaker at the Federal Party's convention later this week. It's a political coming-out party of sorts for the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. Until recently, Mr. Carney's role as a central banker required him to avoid any hint of partisanship, but he is known to have toyed with the idea of jumping into politics. Mr. Carney, though, once made fun of the idea when he likened being a political leader to being a circus clown. McMaster University blood expert Dr. Menaka Pai says people who have a history of clots are not at a greater risk for developing them after getting the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. She says the changing rules around the shot may be concerning, but it's actually a sign that the safety system is working the way it should. The rare blood clots occurred most in people under the age of 55. Executions have been stayed in Montana since 2015, but legislation is moving to the state Senate this week that could affect a Canadian on death row. Red Deer, Alberta native Ronald Smith has been on death row since 1983 for the murders of two young Indigenous men while he was high on LSD and alcohol. His daughter wants him to be allowed to serve a life sentence in Canada. A new bill that would allow the state to use any intravenous injection in a lethal quantity has passed in the House of Representatives and is to be voted on this week by the Senate. Country music artist Paul Brandt says the COVID-19 pandemic has added a sense of urgency to his advocacy work fighting human trafficking in Alberta. Mr. Brandt is leading a task force that aims to offer recommendations to tackle the issue. He says traffickers take advantage of young people and others who are vulnerable and isolated during the pandemic. All right, up next, this past week, we discussed Ontario's recent province-wide lockdown and how it impacts the province's hotspot regions already under gray zone restrictions. We spoke with the mayor of Mississauga, Mayor Bonnie Crombie, coming up next. Stay with us on the Forum Daily Week in Review. This past weekend, the Ontario government pulled the emergency brake in their pandemic restrictions plan and placed the province under lockdown in response to surging COVID-19 infections and intensive care admissions that are being driven by rising rates of the more deadly variants of concern. However, considering that Ontario's hotspots, the Toronto and Peel region, have been under a grey lockdown zone for over 4 months, some officials are calling for a change in strategy. Meanwhile, it was announced yesterday that all schools in the Peel region were ordered to close and operate online. Now, the top medical officers for Peel, Toronto, and Ottawa are calling for a stay-at-home order in those regions to further protect residents. Well, to give us her perspective and reaction to recent restrictions and school closures, we are joined by the Mayor of Mississauga, Mayor Bonnie Crombie. Welcome to Forum Daily, ma'am.
Thank you for having me today.
Now, let's start with the most recent announcement of school closures in the Peel region. It seemed a little last minute for parents, but was this expected by officials, and was this the right move?
Well, we have been experiencing a surge in our cases. We are now averaging 500 cases each and every day in the region of Peel, and certainly Dr. Lowe has been talking about school closures. We've always said schools would be the last to close and the first to open, but we looked at the conditions in our community, which were not only the rising case counts, but they were also the situation in our hospitals, which are seeing 15 to 22 new cases each and every day. Let me go through some of the numbers for you. The numbers have been doubling every 10 days in the hospital. We have 83 patients that are COVID positive, including a number in addition who have COVID-related illness that continues. 20 in the ICU at Trillium Health Partners in Mississauga, and equal to that at William Osler in Brampton. So you can see our hospitals now are surging as well. They're at 100% capacity, and they are now transferring patients once again to other regions such as Niagara, Kingston, and Ottawa. In fact, I will share with you that there are more COVID cases in William Osler Hospital than there are in the Vaughan Cortellucci COVID hospital. So you can see the situation became quite dire. We are looking at what additional measures may be put in place, which may be expanding the definition of non-essentials to close more businesses. And of course, the mayors have been petitioning the province to increase the flow of the supply of vaccine to the hotspots such as Peel region. And in addition, to move forward those workers, those essential and more vulnerable workers who are in our manufacturing and our warehousing, etc., our teachers, in fact, as well, transit workers who cannot work from home, and they are to be vaccinated in phase 2, but we are suggesting that they be moved up. They be moved up. I don't see us changing the course, the direction of the upwardly trending numbers until we can address the source. And the source is largely in these large employment places, such as the Amazons, where we saw 900 cases, the Canada Post, etc. Let's get those workers in vulnerable settings and our other essential workers vaccinated.
Now, you're mentioning vaccine priorities for frontline workers and hard-hit communities. We know Ontario's second phase does involve vaccinations for essential workers, but what is missing here in the second phase? And do you think it's been planned accurately and fairly?
Well, in retrospect, perhaps not, but our knowledge of this virus and how to solve it keeps evolving at the same time. So with respect to vaccinations, yes, phase 2, anyone who couldn't work from home would be vaccinated. But if we look at the case of teachers, their number would be called in June, and of course they'll be off for the summer, so that does us no good. We need to get the teachers vaccinated, and now's the time to do it, of course, because they'll be home for the next 2 weeks with online classes. classes, let's get those teachers in. I will say that the largest issue has been the stable supply of the vaccine. And the hardest hit regions like Peel were not getting an adequate supply. We weren't getting a supply commensurate with our population, let alone with our case count numbers. If we reflect 20% of the cases in Ontario, then of course we should be getting 20% of the vaccine. We won't solve this virus until we can change it, get control of it in the hot spots like Peel.
All right, Mayor Crombie, we've got about 30 seconds left, but some doctors are recommending a stay-at-home order. Do you think this is a next step for officials to consider?
So what we do know is those stay-at-home orders only are effective. They only work effectively if they're right across the GTHA. To have a stay-at-home order in Peel or Toronto doesn't work.
Coming up on our weekend review, a group is working on reviving the Inuktitut dialogue. Fewer calls are being made to the National Smoking Hotline, and SpaceX rocket debris was found on a Washington state farm. Some of the brightest tech minds are leaving big city labs in Toronto and Silicon Valley for eastern Nova Scotia. The Verschuren Centre for Sustainability and Energy and the Environment on Cape Breton is becoming a hub for cutting-edge biotechnology startups. Inside the centre's carbon-neutral glass and concrete structure, entrepreneurs are testing innovations at scale using industrial equipment like bioreactors, radio frequency dryers, and fermenters. In bigger cities, startups are often small fish in a big pond, but are finding overwhelming support in Nova Scotia. A group is working to revive a dialect of Inuktitut that is at risk of disappearing in just a few generations. Inuinnaqtun is spoken by fewer than 600 people in a handful of communities in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Kitikmeot Heritage Society is determined to make sure the dialect survives. It is raising money for a campaign to document the language and teach it to young people, including through pairing elders with youth. The American Library Association reports it received more than 270 challenges to books last year, despite libraries being shut down due to the pandemic. That is about 100 fewer than in 2019. Among the books targeted were Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye and Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Alex Gino's George was the most frequently criticized book, with objections primarily focused on its LGBTQ content. A new U.S. study concludes that there was not a greater incidence of blood clots in patients who were hospitalized for COVID-19 30 days after they were discharged. The study was not talking about concerns of blood clots in people who received the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. The study of more than 220,000 patients' records suggested that blood clot incidence outside of the hospital is not significantly increased with symptomatic COVID-19 infection. Patients were followed to look at clotting events both in and out of the hospital. A new study finds intense and long-duration exercise isn't enough to counteract the negative effects of long-term weightlessness on the heart. Researchers at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center measured weightlessness for 340 days in an astronaut and 159 days in a swimmer in the Pacific Ocean. They found both men's hearts shrank despite substantial amounts of exercise that usually increases the size of the left ventricle. The stress and uncertainty felt by many as the COVID-19 pandemic drags on may be hindering progress against another deadly health threat, smoking. Fewer smokers called quit smoking hotlines last year in the U.S., and there was even an unusual bump in cigarette sales. The North American Quit Line Consortium says calls to a national hotline fell 27% last year, the biggest drop in a decade. Experts are already concerned about COVID-19's impact on cancer screenings and opioid overdoses, as many people are cut off from routine care and examinations. Authorities say a piece of burning rocket debris seen streaking across the Pacific Northwest sky last week crashed on a farm in eastern Washington state. The Tri-City Herald reports a farmer found a nearly intact piece of the rocket in a field. Police say no one was hurt when the roughly 1.5-meter composite overwrapped pressure vessel hit the ground and left a dent. Details from more than 500 million Facebook users have been found available on a website for hackers. The information appears to be several years old, but it's another example of the vast information that is collected by Facebook and other social media sites and the limits to how secure that information is. Business Insider says the info includes phone numbers, Facebook IDs, full names, locations, birth dates, and email addresses. The California-based company says the leak was old and stemmed from a problem that was fixed in 2019. Florida's governor has issued an executive order banning businesses from requiring customers to show proof that they have been vaccinated against COVID-19 in order to get service. In his executive order, Ron DeSantis asserts that vaccination passports reduce individual freedom and will harm patient privacy. As of this week, more than 2 million Floridans have been infected by the virus and nearly 33,500 have died. Major League Baseball is putting this year's All-Star game from Atlanta pulling this year's All-Stars game from Atlanta over objections to sweeping changes to Georgia's voting laws. Critics have condemned the new rules as being too restrictive and targeting voters of color. The decision to move the July 13th game from Truist Park is the first real economic backlash against the voting law that Republican Governor Brian Kemp quickly signed into law last week. All right, moving to Europe, where the rector of Notre Dame says that the burnt-out Paris Cathedral could remain a building site for decades. Rector Patrick Chauvet says it could be up to 20 years before repairs are completed. The blaze distributed vast amounts of toxic lead from the cathedral's burnt-out roof onto the site and nearby. That complicated the cleanup work that came before restoration efforts could even begin. Stay tuned. More top stories from around the world from this past week coming up after the break. The Iranian government has acknowledged an Iranian cargo ship anchored for years in the Red Sea off Yemen and believed to be a base for the paramilitary Revolutionary Guard has been attacked. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed yesterday's attack on the MV Saviz, suspected to have been carried out by Israel. The assault came as Iran and world powers sat down in Vienna for talks about the U.S. potentially rejoining Tehran's tattered nuclear deal. Russia's foreign minister says Moscow and Islamabad will boost ties in the fight against terrorism. He says Russia will provide unspecified military equipment to Pakistan, and the two will hold joint exercises at sea and in the mountains. Sergei Lavrov's visit today is the first by a Russian foreign minister to Pakistan in 9 years. It comes as Moscow seeks to increase its stature in the region, particularly in Afghanistan, where it has sought to inject itself as a key player in accelerated efforts to find a peaceful end to decades of war. Hong Kong media say 3 activists, including well-known publisher Jimmy Lai, have pleaded guilty to taking part in an unauthorized rally that resulted in violence between police and participants. Mr. Lai is already being held on custody on other charges related to his outspoken opposition to China's crackdown on civil liberties in the former British colony. On Thursday, 7 of Hong Kong's leading democracy advocates, including Mr. Lai and an 82-year-old veteran of the movement, were convicted for organizing a march during massive anti-government protests in 2019 that triggered Beijing's crackdown. China has sentenced a former education official and a former legal official in the northwestern region of Xinjiang to death, with a 2-year reprieve on charges including separatism and bribe-taking. Sattar Sawood and Shirzat Bawudan are the latest of many Xinjiang bureaucrats, almost all members of the Muslim Turkic Uyghur minority group, to be sentenced on national security charges. A court official said both men pleaded guilty and neither would appeal. China has more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims in prison-like re-education centers. Taiwan's foreign minister says the island will defend itself to the very last day if attacked by China. China claims Taiwan as its own territory to be won over peacefully or by force. China flew 10 warplanes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone on Monday and deployed an aircraft carrier group for exercises near Taiwan. China does not recognize Taiwan's democratically elected government, and leader Xi Jinping has said unification between the sides cannot be put off indefinitely. The U.S. State Department says it is talking with allies about China's human rights record and how to handle next year's Beijing Winter Olympics. Human rights groups are protesting China's hosting of the Games that open on February 4, 2022, alleging Chinese abuses against Uyghurs, Tibetans, and residents of Hong Kong. The death toll from Sunday's mudslides in eastern Indonesia has risen to 126, with scores still missing as rain continues to pound the region. The village of Lemaneli and Adonara Island suffered the highest losses, with 67 bodies recovered so far. On nearby Limbata Island, the downpour triggered by a tropical cyclone sent solidified lava from a volcanic eruption in November to crash down on over a dozen villages, killing at least 28 people. Egypt and Sudan say the latest round of talks over Ethiopia's massive dam have failed. They say no progress was made after Addis Ababa rejected a Sudanese proposal to include international mediators. The latest talks, which ended Tuesday, were held in Kinshasa, Congo, and were meant to address a years-long dispute over a giant dam that Ethiopia is building on the Nile River's main tributary. The talks center on the speed at which a planned reservoir is filled behind the dam. Egypt and Sudan, which are largely desert countries, fear the dam will decrease their access to waters from the Nile. African leaders have rallied in a virtual summit, calling for scaled-up actions and financing to combat the effects of climate change on the continent of 1.3 billion people. Presidents from Congo, Senegal, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and other countries talked about the need for support to accelerate the effort against climate change. It has affected food security, health, and other issues on the continent. One of the few copies of the comic book that introduced Superman to the world has sold for a supersized, record-setting price. Online auction company ComicConnect.com announced yesterday that the issue of Action Comics 1 went for $3.25 million US in a private sale. Experts say the comic, published in 1938, is really the beginning of the superhero genre. It also told readers about the origins of Superman, how he came to Earth from another planet and went by Clark Kent. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next time.